And I said, "It is very well to speak like this and to believe that it is so, but suppose someone were to quote against it our Lord's narrative about those who are in hell, as not harmonizing with the results of our inquiry. How are we to be prepared with an answer?" The teacher replied, "The expressions of that narrative of the Word are certainly material. But still, many hints are interspersed in it to rouse the skillful inquirer to a more discriminating study of it. I mean that he who parts the good from the bad by a great gulf, and makes the man in torment crave for a drop to be conveyed by a finger, and the man who has been ill-treated in this life rest on a patriarch's bosom, and who relates their previous death and consignment to the tomb, takes an intelligent searcher of his meaning far beyond a superficial interpretation. For what sort of eyes has the rich man to lift up in hell when he has left his bodily eyes in the tomb? And how can a disembodied spirit feel any flame? And what sort of tongue can he crave to be cooled with the drop of water when he has lost his tongue of flesh? What is the finger that is to convey to him this drop? What sort of place is the bosom of repose? The bodies of both of them are in the tomb, and their souls are disembodied, and do not consist of parts either. And so, it is impossible to make the framework of the narrative correspond with the truth if we understand it literally. We can do that only by translating each detail into an equivalent in the world of ideas. Thus we must think of the gulf as that which parts ideas which may not be confounded from running together, not as a chasm of the earth. Such a chasm, however vast it were, could be traversed with no difficulty by a disembodied intelligence, since intelligence can in no time be wherever it will. What then, I asked, are the fire and the gulf and the other features in the picture? Are they not that which they are said to be? I think, she replied, that the gospel signifies by means of each of them certain doctrines with regard to our question of the soul. For when the patriarch first says to the rich man, "You in your lifetime received your good things," and in the same way speaks of the poor man, that he, namely, has done his duty in bearing his share of life's evil things, and then, after that, adds with regard to the gulf that it is a barrier between them, he evidently, by such expressions, intimates a very important truth, and to my thinking, it is as follows. Once, man's life had but one character, and by that I mean that it was to be found only in the category of the good, and had no contact with evil. The first of God's commandments attests the truth of this, that namely which gave to man unstinted enjoyment of all the blessings of paradise, forbidding only that which was a mixture of good and evil, and so composed of contraries, but making death the penalty for transgressing in that particular. But man, acting freely by a voluntary impulse, deserted the lot that was unmixed with evil, and drew upon himself that which was a mixture of contraries. Yet divine providence did not leave that recklessness of ours without a corrective. Death indeed, as the fixed penalty for breaking the law, necessarily fell upon its transgressors. But God divided the life of man into two parts, namely, this present life, and that out of the body hereafter. And he placed on the first a limit of the briefest possible time, while he prolonged the other into eternity. And in his love for man, he gave him his choice to have the one or the other of those things. Good or evil, I mean, in which of the two parts he liked. Either in this short and transitory life, or in those endless ages whose limit is infinity. Now, these expressions good and evil are equivocal. They are used in two senses, one relating to mind and the other to sense. Some classify as good whatever is pleasant to feeling. Others are confident that only that which is perceptible by intelligence is good and deserves that name. Those, then, whose reasoning powers have never been exercised and who have never had a glimpse of the better way, soon use up on gluttony in this fleshly life the dividend of good which their constitution can claim, and they reserve none of it for the afterlife. But those who by a discreet and sober-minded calculation economize the powers of living are afflicted by things painful to sense here, but they reserve their good for the succeeding life, and so their happier lot is lengthened out to last as long as that eternal life. This, in my opinion, is the gulf, which is not made by the parting of the earth, but by those decisions in this life which result in a separation into opposite characters. The man who has once chosen pleasure in this life and has not cured his inconsiderateness by repentance places the land of the good beyond his own reach, for he has dug against himself the yawning, impassable abyss of a necessity that nothing can break through. This is the reason, I think, that the name of Abraham's bosom is given to that good situation of the soul in which Scripture makes the athlete of endurance repose. For it is related of this patriarch first, of all up to that time born, that he exchanged the enjoyment of the present for the hope of the future. He was stripped of all the surroundings in which his life at first was passed, and resided among foreigners, and thus purchased by present annoyance future blessedness. As then, figuratively, we call a particular circuit of the ocean a bosom, so does Scripture seem to me to express the idea of those measureless blessings above by the word bosom, meaning a place into which all virtuous voyagers of this life are, when they have put in from hence, brought to anchor in the waveless harbor of that gulf of blessings. Meanwhile, the denial of these blessings which they witness becomes in the others a flame which burns the soul and causes the craving for the refreshment of one drop out of that ocean of blessings wherein the saints are affluent, which nevertheless they do not get. If, too, you consider the tongue and the eye and the finger and the other names of bodily organs which occur in the conversation between those disembodied souls, you will be persuaded that this conjecture of ours about them chimes in with the opinion we have already stated about the soul. Look closely into the meaning of those words. For as the concourse of atoms forms the substance of the entire body, so it is reasonable to think that the same cause operates to complete the substance of every member of the body. If then the soul is present with the atoms of the body when they are again mingled with the universe, it will not only be cognizant of the entire mass which once came together to form the whole body, and will be present with it, but besides that will not fail to know the particular materials of each one of the members, so as to remember by what divisions among the atoms our limbs were completely formed. There is then nothing improbable in supposing that what is present in the complete Mass is present also in every division of the Mass. If one then thinks of those atoms in which each detail of the body potentially inheres, and surmises that the Scripture means a finger and a tongue and an eye and the rest, as existing after dissolution only in the sphere of the soul, one will not miss the probable truth. Moreover, if each detail carries the mind away from a material acceptation of the story, surely the hell, which we have just been speaking of, cannot reasonably be thought a place so named. Rather, we are there told by Scripture about a certain unseen and immaterial situation in which the soul resides. In this story of the rich and the poor man, we are taught another doctrine also, which is intimately connected with our former discoveries. The story makes the sensual, pleasure-loving man, when he sees that his own case is one that admits of no escape, evince forethought for his relations on earth. And when Abraham tells him that the life of those still in the flesh is not unprovided with a guidance, for they may find it at hand, if they will, in the law and the prophets, he still continues entreating that just patriarch, and asks that a sudden and convincing message brought by someone risen from the dead may be sent to them. What then, I asked, is the doctrine here? Why, seeing that Lazarus' soul is occupied with his present blessings and turns round to look at nothing he has left, while the rich man is still attached with a cement, as it were, even after death, to the life of feeling, which he does not divest himself of even when he has ceased to live, still keeping as he does flesh and blood in his thoughts. For in his entreaty that his kindred may be exempted from his sufferings, he plainly shows that he is not freed yet from fleshly feeling. In such details of the story, she continued, I think our Lord teaches us this, that those still living in the flesh must, as much as ever they can, separate and free themselves, in a way, from its attachments by virtuous conduct, in order that after death they may not need a second death to cleanse them from the remnants that are owing to this cement of the flesh. And when once the bonds are loosed from around the soul, her soaring up to the good may be swift and unimpeded, with no anguish of the body to distract her. For if anyone becomes wholly and thoroughly carnal in thought, such a one, with every motion and energy of the soul absorbed in fleshly desires, is not parted from such attachments even in the disembodied state. Just as those who have lingered long in noisome places do not part with the unpleasantness contracted by that lengthened stay, even when they pass into a sweet atmosphere, so it is that when the change is made into the impalpable unseen, not even then will it be possible for the lovers of the flesh to avoid dragging away with them, under any circumstances, some fleshly foulness, and thereby their torment will be intensified, their soul having been materialized by such surroundings. I think, too, that this view of the matter harmonizes, to a certain extent, with the assertion made by some persons that around their graves shadowy phantoms of the departed are often seen. If this is really so, an inordinate attachment of that particular soul to the life in the flesh is proved to have existed, causing it to be unwilling, even when expelled from the flesh, to fly clean away, and to admit the complete change of its form into the impalpable. It remains near the frame even after the dissolution of the frame, and though now outside it, hovers regretfully over the place where its material is, and continues to haunt it. Then, after a moment's reflection on the meaning of these latter words, I said, I think that a contradiction now arises between what you have said and the result of our former examination of the passions. For if on the one hand the activity of such movements within us is to be held as arising from our kinship with the brutes, such movements, I mean, as were enumerated in our previous discussion, anger, for instance, and fear, desire of pleasure, and so on. And on the other hand, it was affirmed that virtue consists in the good employment of these movements, and vice in their bad employment. And in addition to this, we discussed the actual contribution of each of the other passions to a virtuous life, and found that through desire above all, we were brought nearer to God, drawn up by its chain, as it were, from earth towards Him. I think that part of the discussion is in a way opposed to that which we are now aiming at. How so? She asked. Why, when every unreasoning instinct is quenched within us after our purgation, this principle of desire will not exist any more than the other principles, and this being removed, it looks as if the striving after the better way would also cease, no other emotion remaining in the soul that can stir us up to the appetence of good. To that objection, she replied, we answer this. The speculative and critical faculty is the property of the soul's godlike part, for it is by these that we grasp the deity also. If then, whether by forethought here or by purgation hereafter, our soul becomes free from any emotional connection with the brute creation, there will be nothing to impede its contemplation of the beautiful. For this last is essentially capable of attracting in a certain way every being that looks toward it. If then the soul is purified of every vice, it will most certainly be in the sphere of beauty. The deity is in very substance beautiful, and to the deity the soul will, in its state of purity, have affinity, and the soul will embrace Him as like itself. Whenever this happens, then, there will be no longer any need of the impulse of desire to lead the way to the beautiful. Whoever passes his time in darkness, he it is who will be under the influence of a desire for the light. But whenever he comes into the light, then enjoyment takes the place of desire, and the power to enjoy renders desire useless and out of date. It will therefore be no detriment to our participation in the good that the soul should be free from such emotions, and turning back upon herself, should know herself accurately what her actual nature is, and should behold the original beauty reflected in the mirror and figure of her own beauty. For truly, herein consists the real assimilation to the divine, in making our own life, in some degree, a copy of the Supreme Being. For a nature like that which transcends all thought, and is far removed from all that we observe within ourselves, proceeds in its existence in a very different manner to what we do in this present life. Man, possessing a constitution whose law it is to be moving, is carried in that particular direction whither the impulse of his will directs. and so his soul is not affected in the same way toward what lies before it, as one may say, as to what it has left behind. For hope leads the forward movement, but it is memory that succeeds that movement when it has advanced to the attainment of the hope. And if it is to something intrinsically good that hope thus leads on the soul, the print that this exercise of the will leaves upon the memory is a bright one. But if hope has seduced the soul with some phantom only of the good, and the excellent way has been missed, then the memory that succeeds what has happened becomes shame, and an internal war is thus waged in the soul between memory and hope, because the last has been such a bad leader of the will. Such, in fact, is the state of mind that shame gives expression to. The soul is stung, as it were, at the result. Its remorse for its ill-considered attempt is a whip that makes it feel to the quick, and it would bring in oblivion to its aid against its tormentor. Now, in our case, nature, owing to its being indigent of the good, is aiming always at this which is still wanting to it. And this aiming at a thing still missing is this very habit of desire, which our constitution displays equally, whether it is balked of the real good or wins that which it is good to win. But a nature that surpasses every idea that we can form of the good, and transcends all other power, being in no want of anything that can be regarded as good, is itself the fullness of every good. It does not move in the sphere of the good by way of participation in it only, but it is itself the substance of the good, whatever we imagine the good to be. It neither gives scope for any rising hope, for hope manifests activity in the direction of something absent. But what a man has, why does he yet hope for it? As the apostle asks. Nor is it in want of the activity of the memory for the knowledge of things. That which is actually seen has no need of being remembered. Since then, this divine nature is beyond any particular good, and to the good is an object of love, it follows that when the divine nature looks within itself, it wishes for what it contains, and contains what it wishes, and admits nothing external. Indeed, there is nothing external to the divine nature, with the sole exception of evil, which, strange as it may seem to say, possesses existence in not existing at all. For there is no other origin of evil except the negation of what exists, and the truly existent forms the substance of the good. That, therefore, which is not to be found in the existent must be in the non-existent. Whenever the soul, then, having divested itself of the multifarious emotions incident to its nature, gets its divine form, and, mounting above desire, enters within that towards which it was once incited by that desire, it offers no harbor within itself, either for hope or memory. It holds the object of the one. The other is extruded from the consciousness by its occupation in enjoying all that is good. And thus the soul copies the life that is above, and is conformed to the peculiar features of the divine nature. none of its habits are left to it except that of love, which clings by natural affinity to the beautiful. For this is what love is, the inherent affection towards a chosen object. When, then, the soul, having become simple and single in form, and so perfectly godlike, finds that perfectly simple and immaterial good, which is really worth enthusiasm and love, it attaches itself to the good and blends with it by means of the movement and activity of love, fashioning itself according to that which it is continually finding and grasping, becoming by this assimilation to the good all that the nature of that which it participates is. The soul will consequently, owing to there being no lack of any good in that thing itself in which it participates, be itself also in no lack of anything. And so it will expel from within the activity and the habit of desire. For desire arises only when the thing missed is not found. For this teaching, we have the authority of God's own apostle, who announces a subduing and a ceasing of all other activities, even for the good, which are within us, and finds no limit for love alone. Prophecies, he says, shall fail, forms of knowledge shall cease, but charity never fails, which is equivalent to its always being as it is. And though he says that faith and hope have endured so far by the side of love, yet again he prolongs love's date beyond theirs, and with good reason too. For hope is in operation only so long as the enjoyment of the things hoped for is not to be had, and faith in the same way is a support in the uncertainty about the things hoped for so he defines it, the substance of things hoped for. But when the thing hoped for actually comes, then all other faculties are reduced to quiescence, and love alone remains active, finding nothing to succeed itself. Love, therefore, is the foremost of all excellent achievements, and the first of the commandments of the law. If ever then the soul reach this goal, it will be in no need of anything else. It will embrace that plenitude of things which are, whereby alone it seems in any way to preserve within itself the stamp of God's actual blessedness. For the life of the Supreme Being is love, seeing that the beautiful is necessarily lovable to those who recognize it. And the deity does recognize it, and so this recognition becomes love, that which he recognizes being essentially beautiful. This true beauty the insolence of satiety cannot touch, and no satiety interrupting this continuous capacity to love the beautiful. God's life will have its activity in love, which life is thus in itself beautiful, and is essentially of a loving disposition toward the beautiful, and receives no check to this activity of love. In fact, in the beautiful, no limit is to be found, so that love should have to cease with any limit of the beautiful. This last can be ended only by its opposite. But when you have a good as here, which is in its essence incapable of changing for the worse, then that good will go on unchecked into infinity. moreover, as every being is capable of attracting its like, and humanity is in a way like God, as bearing within itself some resemblances to its prototype. The soul is by a strict necessity attracted to the kindred deity. In fact, what belongs to God must by all means and at any cost be preserved for him. If then, on the one hand, the soul is unencumbered with superfluities, and no trouble connected with the body presses it down, its advance towards him who draws it to himself is sweet and congenial. But suppose, on the other hand, that the soul has been transfixed with the nails of propension, so as to be held down to a habit connected with material things. A case like that of those in the ruins caused by earthquakes, whose bodies are crushed by mounds of rubbish. And let us imagine, by way of illustration, that these are not only pressed down by the weight of the ruins, but have been pierced as well with spikes and splinters discovered with them in the rubbish. What then would be naturally the plight of those bodies when they were being dragged by relatives from the ruins to receive the holy rites of burial? Mangled and torn entirely, disfigured in the most direful manner conceivable, with the nails beneath the heap harrowing them by the very violence necessary to pull them out. Such, I think, is the plight of the soul as well, when the divine force, for God's very love of man, drags that which belongs to him from the ruins of the irrational and material. Not in hatred or revenge for a wicked life, to my thinking, does God bring upon sinners those painful dispensations. He is only claiming and drawing to himself whatever came into existence to please him. But while he, for a noble end, is attracting the soul to himself, the fountain of all blessedness, it is the occasion necessarily to the being so attracted of a state of torture, just as those who refine gold from the dross which it contains not only get this base dross to melt in the fire, but are obliged to melt the pure gold along with the alloy. And then, while this last is being consumed, the gold remains. So, while evil is being consumed in the purgatorial fire, the soul that is welded to this evil must inevitably be in the fire too, until the spurious material alloy is consumed and annihilated by this fire. If a clay of a more tenacious kind is deeply plastered around a rope, and then the end of the rope is put through a narrow hole, and then someone on the further side violently pulls it by that end, the result must be that while the rope itself obeys the force exerted, the clay that has been plastered upon it is scraped off it with this violent pulling, and is left outside the hole. And moreover is the cause why the rope does not run easily through the passage, but has to undergo a violent tension at the hands of the puller. In such a manner, I think, we may figure to ourselves the agonized struggle of that soul which has wrapped itself up in earthy material passions, when God is drawing it, his own one, to himself. And the foreign matter which has somehow grown into its substance has to be scraped from it by main force, and so occasions the soul that keen, intolerable anguish. Then it seems, I said, that it is not punishment, chiefly and principally, that the deity as judge afflicts sinners with, but he operates, as your argument has shown, only to get the good separated from the evil, and to attract the good within the communion of blessedness. That, said the teacher, is my meaning. And also that the agony will be measured by the amount of evil there is in each individual. For it would not be reasonable to think that the man who has remained so long as we have supposed in evil known to be forbidden, and that the man who has fallen only into moderate sins should be tortured to the same amount in the judgment upon their vicious habits. But according to the quantity of material will be the longer or shorter time that agonizing flame will be burning. That is, as long as there is fuel to feed it. In the case of the man who has acquired a heavy weight of material, the consuming fire must necessarily be very searching. But where that which the fire has to feed upon has spread less far, there the penetrating fierceness of the punishment is mitigated, so far as the object itself, in the amount of its evil, is diminished. In any and every case, evil must be removed out of existence, so that, as we said above, the absolutely non-existent should cease to be at all. Since it is not in its nature that evil should exist outside the will, does it not follow that when it shall be that every will rests in God, evil will be reduced to complete annihilation, owing to no receptacle being left for it? But, said I, what help can one find in this devout hope, when one considers the greatness of the evil in undergoing torture even for a single year? And if that intolerable anguish be prolonged for the interval of an age, what grain of comfort is left from any subsequent expectation to him whose purgation is thus commensurate with an entire age? Why, either we must plan to keep the soul absolutely untouched and free from any stain of evil, or, if our passionate nature makes that quite impossible, then we must plan that our failures in excellence consist only in mild and easily curable derelictions. For the gospel in its teaching distinguishes between a debtor of 10,000 talents and a debtor of 500 pence, and of 50 pence, and of a farthing, which is the uttermost of coins. It proclaims that God's just judgment reaches to all, and enhances the payment necessary as the weight of the debt increases, and on the other hand does not overlook the very smallest debts. But the gospel tells us that this payment of debts was not effected by the refunding of money, but that the indebted man was delivered to the tormentors until he should pay the whole debt. And that means nothing else than paying in the coin of torment the inevitable recompense. The recompense, I mean, that consists in taking the share of pain incurred during his lifetime when he inconsiderately chose mere pleasure, undiluted with its opposite, so that, having put off from him all that foreign growth which sin is, and discarded the shame of any debts, he might stand in liberty and fearlessness. Now, liberty is the coming up to a state which owns no master and is self-regulating. It is that with which we were gifted by God at the beginning, but which has been obscured by the feeling of shame arising from indebtedness. Liberty, too, is in all cases one and the same, essentially. It has a natural attraction to itself. It follows, then, that as everything that is free will be united with its like, and as virtue is a thing that has no master, that is free, everything that is free will be united with virtue. But further, the divine being is the fountain of all virtue. Therefore, those who have parted with evil will be united with him. And so, as the Apostle says, God will be all in all. For this utterance seems to me plainly to confirm the opinion we have already arrived at, for it means that God will be instead of all other things, and in all. For while our present life is active among a variety of multiform conditions, and the things we have relations with are numerous, for instance, time, air, locality, food and drink, clothing, sunlight, lamplight, and other necessities of life, none of which, many though they be, are God, that blessed state which we hope for is in need of none of these things, but the divine being will become all, and instead of all, to us, distributing himself proportionately to every need of that existence. It is plain, too, from Holy Scripture that God becomes to those who deserve it locality and home and clothing and food and drink and light and riches and dominion and everything thinkable and nameable that goes to make our life happy. But he that becomes all things will be in all things too. And herein it appears to me that Scripture teaches the complete annihilation of evil. If that is, God will be in all existing things, evil plainly will not then be among them. For if anyone was to assume that it did exist, then how will the belief that God will be in all be kept intact? The accepting of that one thing, evil, mars the comprehensiveness of the term all. But he that will be in all will never be in that which does not exist. What then, I asked, are we to say to those whose hearts fail at these calamities? We will say to them, replied the teacher, this: it is foolish, good people, for you to fret and complain of the chain of this fixed sequence of life's realities. You do not know the goal towards which each single dispensation of the universe is moving. You do not know that all things have to be assimilated to the divine nature in accordance with the artistic plan of their author, in a certain regularity and order. Indeed, it was for this that intelligent beings came into existence, namely, that the riches of the divine blessings should not lie idle. The all-creating wisdom fashioned these souls, these receptacles with free wills, these vessels, as it were, for this very purpose, that there should be some capacities able to receive his blessings and become continually larger with the inpouring of the stream. Such are the wonders that the participation in the divine blessings works. It makes him into whom they come larger and more capacious. from his capacity to receive, it gets for the receiver an actual increase in bulk as well, and he never stops enlarging. The fountain of blessings wells up unceasingly, and the partaker's nature, finding nothing superfluous and without a use in that which it receives, makes the whole influx an enlargement of its own proportions, and becomes at once more wishful to imbibe the nobler nourishment and more capable of containing it. Each grows along with each, both the capacity which is nursed in such abundance of blessings and so grows greater, and the nurturing supply, which comes on in a flood, answering to the growth of those increasing powers. It is likely, therefore, that this bulk will mount to such a magnitude as there is no limit to check, so that we should not grow into it. With such a prospect before us, are you angry that our nature is advancing towards its goal along the path appointed for it? Why, our career cannot run there except that which weighs us down. I mean, this encumbering load of earthiness be shaken off the soul. Nor can we be domiciled in purity with the corresponding part of our nature unless we have cleansed ourselves by a better training from the habit of affection which we have contracted in life toward this earthiness. But if there be in you any clinging to this body, and the being unlocked from this darling thing give you pain, let not this either make you despair. You will behold this bodily envelopment which is now dissolved in death, woven again out of the same atoms. Not indeed into this organization with its gross and heavy texture, but with its threads worked up into something more subtle and ethereal, so that you will not only have near you that which you love, but it will be restored to you with a brighter and more entrancing beauty. But it somehow seems to me now, I said, that the doctrine of the resurrection necessarily comes on for our discussion. A doctrine which I think is, even at first sight, true as well as credible, as it is told us in Scripture, so that will not come in question between us. But since the weakness of the human understanding is strengthened still farther by any arguments that are intelligible to us, it would be well not to leave this part of the subject either without philosophical examination. Let us consider then what ought to be said about it. As for the thinkers, the teacher went on, outside our own system of thought, they have, with all their diverse ways of looking at things, one in one point, another in another, approached and touched the doctrine of the resurrection. While they none of them exactly coincide with us, they have in no case wholly abandoned such an expectation. Some indeed make human nature vile in their comprehensiveness, maintaining that a soul becomes alternately that of a man and of something irrational, that it transmigrates into various bodies, changing at pleasure from the man into fowl, fish, or beast, and then returning to humankind. While some extend this absurdity even to trees and shrubs, so that they consider their wooden life as corresponding and akin to humanity. Others of them hold only thus much, that the soul exchanges one man for another man, so that the life of humanity is continued always by means of the same souls, which being exactly the same in number, are being born perpetually, first into one generation and then into another. As for ourselves, we take our stand upon the tenets of the Church, and assert that it will be well to accept only so much of these speculations as is sufficient to show that those who indulge in them are to a certain extent in accord with the doctrine of the resurrection. Their statement, for instance, that the soul, after its release from this body, insinuates itself into other bodies, is not absolutely out of harmony with the revival which we hope for. For our view, which maintains that the body, both now and again in the future, is composed of the atoms of the universe, is held equally by these heathens. In fact, you cannot imagine any constitution of the body independent of a concourse of these atoms. But the divergence lies in this. We assert that the same body again as before, composed of the same atoms, is compacted around the soul. They suppose that the soul alights on other bodies, not only rational, but irrational, and even insensate. And while all are agreed that these bodies which the soul resumes derive their substance from the atoms of the universe, they part company from us in thinking that they are not made out of identically the same atoms as those which, in this mortal life, grew around the soul. Let, then, this external testimony stand for the fact that it is not contrary to probability that the soul should again inhabit a body. After that, however, it is incumbent upon us to make a survey of the inconsistencies of their position, and it will be easy thus, by means of the consequences that arise as we follow out the consistent view, to bring the truth to light. What then is to be said about these theories? This, that those who would have it that the soul migrates into natures divergent from each other, seems to me to obliterate all natural distinctions, to blend and confuse together in every possible respect the rational, the irrational, the sentient, and the insensate. If, that is, all these are to pass into each other, with no distinct natural order secluding them from mutual transition. To say that one and the same soul, on account of a particular environment of body, is at one time a rational and intellectual soul, and that then it is caverned along with the reptiles, or herds with the birds, or is a beast of burden, or a carnivorous one, or swims in the deep, or even drops down to an insensate thing, so as to strike out roots or become a complete tree, producing buds on branches, and from those buds a flower or a thorn, or a fruit edible or noxious. To say this is nothing short of making all things the same, and believing that one single nature runs through all beings, that there is a connection between them which blends and confuses hopelessly all the marks by which one could be distinguished from another. The philosopher, who asserts that the same thing may be born in anything, intends no less than that all things are to be one. When the observed differences in things are for him no obstacle to mixing together things which are utterly incongruous, he makes it necessary that even when one sees one of the creatures that are venom-darting or carnivorous, one should regard it, in spite of appearances, as of the same tribe, nay, even of the same family as oneself. With such beliefs, a man will look upon even hemlock as not alien to his own nature, detecting as he does humanity in the plant. The bunch of grapes itself, produced though it be by cultivation for the purpose of sustaining life, he will not regard without suspicion, for it too comes from a plant. And we find that even the fruit of the ears of grain upon which we live are plants. How then can one put in the sickle to cut them down? And how can one squeeze the bunch, or pull up the thistle from the field, or gather flowers, or hunt birds, or set fire to the logs of the funeral pyre, it being all the while uncertain whether we are not laying violent hands on our kinsmen or ancestors or fellow countrymen, and whether it is not through the medium of some body of theirs that the fire is being kindled and the cup mixed and the food prepared. To think that in the case of any single one of these things, a soul of a man has become a plant or animal, while no marks are stamped upon them to indicate what sort of plant or animal it is that has been a man, and what sort has sprung from other beginnings, such a conception as this will dispose him who has entertained it to feel an equal amount of interest in everything. He must, perforce, either harden himself against actual human beings who are in the land of the living, or, if his nature inclines him to love his kindred, he will feel alike towards every kind of life, whether he meet it in reptiles or in wild beasts. Why, if the holder of such an opinion go into a thicket of trees, even then he will regard the trees as a crowd of men. What sort of life will his be when he has to be tender towards everything on the ground of kinship, or else hardened toward mankind on account of his seeing no difference between them and the other creatures? From what has already been said, then, we must reject this theory. And there are many other considerations as well, which on the grounds of mere consistency lead us away from it. For I have heard persons who hold these opinions saying that whole nations of souls are hidden away somewhere in a realm of their own, living a life analogous to that of the embodied souls. But such is the fineness and buoyancy of their substance that they themselves roll around with the revolution of the universe, and that these souls, having individually lost their wings through some gravitation toward evil, become embodied. First this takes place in men, and after that, passing from a human life, owing to brutish affinities in their passions, they are reduced to the level of brutes, and leaving that, drop down to this insensate life of pure nature, which you have been hearing so much of, so that that inherently fine and buoyant thing that the soul is first becomes weighted and downward tending in consequence of some vice, and so migrates to a human body. Then its reasoning powers are extinguished and it goes on living in some brute. And then even this gift of sensation is withdrawn and it changes into the insensate plant life. But after that mounts up again by the same gradations until it is restored to its place in heaven. Now, this doctrine will at once be found, even after a very cursory survey, to have no coherency within itself. For first, seeing that the soul is to be dragged down from its life in heaven on account of evil there to the condition of a tree, and is then from this point, on account of virtue exhibited there, to return to heaven, their theory will be unable to decide which is to have the preference, the life in heaven or the life in a tree. A circle, in fact, of the same sequences will be perpetually traversed, where the soul, at whatever point it may be, has no resting place. If it thus lapses from the disembodied state to the embodied, and thence to the insensate, and then springs back to the disembodied, an inextricable confusion of good and evil must result in the minds of those who thus teach. For the life in heaven will no more preserve its blessedness, since evil can touch heaven's denizens, then the life in trees will be devoid of virtue, since it is from this, they say, that the rebound of the soul toward the good begins, while from heaven it begins the evil life again. Secondly, seeing that the soul as it moves round in heaven is there entangled with evil and in consequence is dragged down to live in mere matter, from whence, however, it is again lifted into its residence on high, it follows that those philosophers establish the very contrary of their own views. They establish, namely, that the life in matter is the purgation of evil, while that undeviating revolution along with the stars is the foundation and cause of evil in every soul. It is here that the soul, by means of virtue, grows its wings and then soars upward. And it is there that those wings, by reason of evil, fall off, so that it descends and clings to this lower world and is commingled with the grossness of material nature. But the untenableness of this view does not stop even in this, namely that it contains assertions diametrically opposed to each other. Beyond this, their fundamental conception itself cannot stand secure on every side. They say, for instance, that a heavenly nature is unchangeable. How then can there be room for any weakness in the unchangeable? If again a lower nature is subject to infirmity, how, in the midst of this infirmity, can freedom from it be achieved? They attempt to amalgamate two things that can never be joined together. They describe strength in weakness, passionlessness in passion. But even to this last view they are not faithful throughout, for they bring home the soul from its material life to that very place whence they had exiled it because of evil there, as though the life in that place was quite safe and uncontaminated, apparently quite forgetting the fact that the soul was weighted with evil there, before it plunged down into this lower world. The blame thrown on the life here below and the praise of the things in heaven are thus interchanged and reversed. For that which was once blamed conducts, in their opinion, to the brighter life, while that which was taken for the better state gives an impulse to the soul's propensity to evil. Expel, therefore, from among the doctrines of the faith all erroneous and shifting suppositions about such matters. We must not follow either, as though they had hit the truth, those who suppose that souls pass from women's bodies to live in men's, or, reversely, that souls that have parted with men's bodies exist in women. Or even if they only say that they pass from men into men or from women into women. As for the former theory, not only has it been rejected for being shifting and illusory and for landing us in opinions diametrically opposed to each other, but it must be rejected also because it is a godless theory, maintaining as it does that nothing among the things in nature is brought into existence without deriving its peculiar constitution from evil at its source. If, that is, neither men, nor plants, nor cattle can be born unless some soul from above has fallen into them, and if this fall is owing to some tendency to evil, then they evidently think that evil controls the creation of all things. In some mysterious way, too, both events are to occur at once: the birth of the man in consequence of a marriage, and the fall of the soul, synchronizing as it must with the proceedings at that marriage. A greater absurdity even than this is involved. If, as is the fact, a large majority of the brute creation copulate in the spring, are we then to say that the spring brings it about that evil is engendered in the revolving world above, so that at one and the same moment there, certain souls are impregnated with evil and so fall, and here certain animals conceive? And what are we to say about the husbandman who sets the vine shoots in the soil? How does his hand manage to have covered in a human soil along with this plant? And how does the molting of wings last simultaneously with his employment in planting? The same absurdity, it is to be observed, exists in the other of the two theories as well. In the direction, I mean, of thinking that the soul must be anxious about the intercourses of those living in wedlock, and must be on the lookout for the times of bringing forth, in order that it may insinuate itself into the bodies then produced. Supposing the man refuses the union, or the woman keeps herself clear of the necessity of becoming a mother, will evil then fail to weigh down that particular soul? Will it be marriage, in consequence, that sounds up above the first note of evil in the soul? Or will this reverse state invade the soul, quite independently of any marriage? But then in this last case, the soul will have to wander about in the interval, like a houseless vagabond, lapsed as it has from its heavenly surroundings, and yet, as may happen in some cases, still without a body to receive it. But how after that can they imagine that the deity exercises any superintendence over the world, referring as they do the beginnings of human lives to this casual and meaningless descent of a soul? For all that follows must necessarily accord with the beginning. And so if a life begins in consequence of a chance accident, the whole course of it becomes at once a chapter of accidents, and the attempt to make the whole world depend on a divine power absurd, when it is made by these men, who deny to the individualities in it a birth from the fiat of the divine will, and refer the several origins of beings to encounters that come of evil, as though there never could have existed such a thing as a human life unless a vice had struck, as it were, its leading note. If the beginning is like that, a sequel will most certainly be set in motion in accordance with that beginning. None would dare to maintain that what is fair can come out of what is foul, any more than from good can come its opposite. We expect fruit in accordance with the nature of the seed. Therefore, this blind movement of chance is to rule the whole of life, and no providence is any more to pervade the world. Nay, even the forecasting by our calculations will be quite useless. Virtue will lose its value, and to turn away from evil will not be worth the while. Everything will be entirely under the control of the driver chance, and our lives will not differ at all from vessels devoid of ballast, and will drift on waves of unaccountable circumstances, now to this, now to that incident of good or evil. The treasures of virtue will never be found in those who owe their constitution to causes quite contrary to virtue. If God really superintends our lives, then confessedly, evil cannot begin life. But if we do owe our birth to evil, then we must go on living in complete uniformity with it. Thereby it will be shown that it is folly to talk about the houses of correction, purgatory, which await us after this life is ended, and the just recompenses, and all the other things there asserted and believed in too, that tend to the suppression of vice. For how can a man, owing as he does his birth to evil, be outside its pale? How can he, whose very nature has its rise in a vice, as they assert, possess any deliberate impulse toward a life of virtue? Take any single one of the brute creation. Animals do not attempt to speak like a human being, but in using the natural kind of utterance, sucked in, as it were, with its mother's milk, it deems it no loss to be deprived of articulate speech. just in the same way, those who believed that a vice was the origin and cause of their being alive will never bring themselves to have a longing after virtue, because it will be a thing quite foreign to their nature. But as a fact, they who by reflecting have cleansed the vision of their soul, do all of them desire and strive after a life of virtue. Therefore, it is by that fact clearly proved that vice is not prior in time to the act of beginning to live, and that our nature did not thence derive its source, but that the all-disposing wisdom of God was the cause of it. In short, that the soul issues on the stage of life in the manner which is pleasing to its Creator, and then, but not before, by virtue of its power of willing, is free to choose that which is to its mind, and so, whatever it may wish to be, it becomes that very thing. We may understand this truth by the example of the eyes. To see is their natural state, but to fail to see results to them either from choice or from disease. This unnatural state may supervene instead of the natural, either by willful shutting of the eyes or by deprivation of their sight through disease. With the like truth, we may assert that the soul derives its constitution from God, and that as we cannot conceive of any vice in Him, it is removed from any necessity of being vicious. That nevertheless, though this is the condition in which it came into being, the soul can be attracted of its own free will in a chosen direction, either willfully shutting its eyes to the good, or letting themselves be damaged by that insidious foe whom we have taken home to live with us, and so passing through life in the darkness of error. Or, reversely, preserving undimmed its sight of the truth, and keeping far away from all weaknesses that can darken it. But then, someone will ask, when and how did the soul come into being? Now, as for the question, how any single thing came into existence, we must banish it altogether from our discussion. Even in the case of things which are quite within the grasp of our understanding, and of which we have sensible perception, it would be impossible for the speculative reason to grasp the how of the production of the phenomenon, so much so that even inspired and saintly men have deemed such questions insoluble. For instance, the Apostle says, "Through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen are not made of things which do appear." He would not, I take it, have spoken like that if he had thought the question could be settled by any efforts of the reasoning powers. While the Apostle affirms that it is an object of his faith that it was by the will of God that the world itself and all which is therein was framed, whatever this world be that involves the idea of the whole visible and invisible creation. He has, on the other hand, left out of the investigation the how of this framing. Nor do I think that this point can ever be reached by any inquirers. The question presents on the face of it many insuperable difficulties. How, for instance, can a world of movement come from one that is at rest? How from the simple and undimensional, that which shows dimension and compositeness? Did it come actually out of the Supreme Being? But the fact that this world presents a difference in kind to that being militates against such a supposition. Did it then come from some other quarter? Yet faith can contemplate nothing as quite outside the divine nature, for we should have to believe in two distinct and separate principles if outside the creative cause we are to suppose something else, which the artificer with all his skill has to put under contribution for the formative processes of the universe. Since then the cause of all things is one and one only, and yet the existences produced by that cause are not of the same nature as its transcendent quality, an inconceivability of equal magnitude arises in both our suppositions, i.e., both that the creation comes straight out of the divine being, and that the universe owes its existence to some cause other than him. For if created things are to be of the same nature as God, we must consider him to be invested with the properties belonging to his creation. Or else, a world of matter, outside the circle of God's substance, and equal, on the score of the absence in it of all beginning, to the eternity of the self-existent one, will have to be ranged against him. And this is, in fact, what the followers of Manes and some of the Greek philosophers who held opinions of equal boldness with him did imagine. And they raised this imagination into a system. In order then to avoid falling into either of these absurdities which the inquiry into the origin of things involves, let us, following the example of the Apostle, leave the question of the how in each created thing without meddling with it at all, but merely observing, incidentally, that the movement of God's will becomes, at any moment that he pleases, a fact, and the intention becomes at once realized in nature. For omnipotence does not leave the plans of its far-seeing skill in the state of unsubstantial wishes, and the actualizing of a wish is substance. In short, the whole world of existing things falls into two divisions, i.e., that of the intelligible and that of the corporeal. And the intelligible creation does not, to begin with, seem to be in any way at variance with a spiritual being, but on the contrary to verge closely upon him, exhibiting as it does that absence of tangible form and of dimension which we rightly attribute to his transcendent nature. The corporeal creation, on the other hand, must certainly be classed among specialties that have nothing in common with the deity, and it does offer this supreme difficulty to the reason, namely, that the reason cannot see how the visible comes out of the invisible, how the hard solid comes out of the intangible, how the finite comes out of the infinite, how that which is circumscribed by certain proportions, where the idea of quantity comes in, can come from that which has no size, no proportions, and so on through each single circumstance of body. But even about this, we can say so much, i.e., that not one of those things which we attribute to body is itself body. Neither figure, nor color, nor weight, nor extension, nor quantity, nor any other qualifying notion whatsoever. But every one of them is a category. It is the combination of them all into a single whole that constitutes body. Seeing then that these several qualifications which complete the particular body are grasped by thought alone and not by sense, and that the deity is a thinking being, what trouble can it be to such a thinking agent to produce the thinkables whose mutual combination generates for us the substance of that body? All this discussion, however, lies outside our present business. The previous question was, if some souls exist anterior to their bodies, when and how do they come into existence? And of this question, again, the part about the how has been left out of our examination and has not been meddled with, as presenting impenetrable difficulties. There remains the question of the when of the soul's commencement of existence. It follows immediately on that which we have already discussed. For if we were to grant that the soul has lived previous to its body in some place of resort peculiar to itself, then we cannot avoid seeing some force in all that fantastic teaching lately discussed, which would explain the soul's habitation of the body as a consequence of some vice. Again, on the other hand, no one who can reflect will imagine an afterbirth of the soul, i.e., that it is younger than the molding of the body. For everyone can see for himself that not one among all the things that are inanimate or soulless possesses any power of motion or of growth. Whereas there is no question about that which is bred in the uterus, both growing and moving from place to place. It remains, therefore, that we must think that the point of commencement for existence is one and the same for body and soul. Also, we affirm that just as the earth receives the sapling from the hands of the husbandman and makes a tree of it without itself imparting the power of growth to its nursling, but only lending it, when placed within itself, the impulse to grow, in this very way, that which is secreted from a man for the planting of a man is itself, to a certain extent, a living being as much gifted with a soul and as capable of nourishing itself as that from which it comes. If this offshoot in its diminutiveness cannot contain at first all the activities and the movements of the soul, we need not be surprised, for neither in the seed of grain is there visible all at once the ear. How indeed could anything so large be crowded into so small a space? But the earth keeps on feeding it with its congenial aliment, and so the grain becomes the ear, without changing its nature while in the clod, but only developing it and bringing it to perfection under the stimulus of that nourishment. As then, in the case of those growing seeds, the advance to perfection is a graduated one, so in man's formation the forces of his soul show themselves in proportion to the size to which his body has attained. They dawn first in the fetus, in the shape of the power of nutrition and of development. After that, they introduce into the organism that has come into the light the gift of perception. Then, when this is reached, they manifest a certain measure of the reasoning faculty, like the fruit of some matured plant, not growing all of it at once, but in a continuous progress along with the shooting up of that plant. Seeing then that which is secreted from one living being to lay the foundations of another living being cannot itself be dead, for a state of deadness arises from the privation of life, and it cannot be that privation should precede the having. We grasp from these considerations the fact that in the compound which results from the joining of both soul and body, there is a simultaneous passage of both into existence. The one does not come first any more than the other comes after. But as to the number of souls, our reason must necessarily contemplate a stopping some day of its increase, so that nature's stream may not flow on forever, pouring forward in her successive births and never staying that onward movement. The reason for our race having some day to come to a standstill is as follows, in our opinion. Since every intellectual reality is fixed in a plenitude of its own, it is reasonable to expect that humanity also will arrive at a goal. For in this respect also, humanity is not to be parted from the intellectual world, so that we are to believe that it will not be visible forever only in defective form, as it is now, For this continual addition of after generations indicates that there is something deficient in our race. Whenever then humanity shall have reached the plenitude that belongs to it, this on-streaming movement of production will altogether cease. It will have touched its destined bourne, and a new order of things, quite distinct from the present precession of births and deaths, will carry on the life of humanity. If there is no birth, it follows necessarily that there will be nothing to die. Composition must precede dissolution, and by composition I mean the coming into this world by being born. Necessarily, therefore, if this synthesis does not proceed, no dissolution will follow. Therefore, if we are to go upon probabilities, the life after this is shown to us beforehand as something that is fixed and imperishable, with no birth and no decay to change it. The teacher finished her exposition, and to the many persons sitting by her bedside, the whole discussion seemed now to have arrived at a fitting conclusion. Nevertheless, fearing that if the teacher's illness took a fatal turn, such as did actually happen, we should have no one among us to answer the objections of the unbelievers to the resurrection, I still insisted. The argument has not yet touched the most vital of all the questions relating to our faith. I mean that the inspired writings, both in the New and Old Testament, declare most emphatically not only that when our race has completed the ordered chain of its existence as the ages lapse through their complete circle, this current streaming onward as generation succeeds generation will cease altogether, but also that then, when the completed universe no longer admits of further increase, all the souls in their entire number will come back out of their invisible and scattered condition into tangibility and light, the identical atoms belonging to each soul reassembling together in the same order as before. And this reconstitution of human life is called in these writings, which contain God's teachings, the resurrection, the entire movement of the atoms receiving the same term as the raising up of that which is actually prostrate on the ground. But, said she, which of these points has been left unnoticed in what has been said? Why, the actual doctrine of the resurrection, I replied. And yet, she answered, much in our long and detailed discussion pointed to that. Then are you not aware, I insisted, of all the objections, a very swarm of them, which our antagonists bring against us in connection with that hope of yours? And I at once tried to repeat all the devices hit upon by their captious champions to upset the doctrine of the resurrection. Then are you not aware, I insisted, of all the objections, a very swarm of them, which our antagonists bring against us in connection with that hope of yours? And I at once tried to repeat all the devices hit upon by their captious champions to upset the doctrine of the resurrection. She, however, replied, first, I think, we must briefly run over the scattered proclamations of this doctrine in Holy Scripture. They shall give the finishing touch to our discourse. Observe, then, that I can hear David in the midst of his praises in the divine songs, saying at the end of the hymnody of the 103rd Psalm, where he has taken for his theme God's administration of the world, you shall take away their breath, and they shall die, and return to their dust. You shall send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. He says that a power of the Spirit, which works in all, vivifies the beings into whom it enters, and deprives those whom he abandons of their life. Seeing then that the dying is declared to occur at the Spirit's departure, and the renewal of these dead ones at his appearance, and seeing, moreover, that in the order of the statement, the death of those who are to be thus renewed comes first, we hold that in these words that mystery of the resurrection is proclaimed to the church, and that David, in the spirit of prophecy, expressed this very gift which you are asking about. You will find this same prophet in another place also saying that the God of the world, the Lord of everything that is, hath showed himself to us, that we may keep the feast amongst the decorations. By that mention of decoration with boughs, he means the Feast of Tabernacle Fixing, which, in accordance with Moses' injunction, has been observed from of old. That lawgiver, I take it, adopting a prophet's spirit, predicted therein things still to come, for though the decoration was always going on, it was never finished. The truth, indeed, was foreshadowed under the type and riddle of those feasts that were always occurring, but the true tabernacle fixing was not yet come. And on this account, the God and Lord of the whole world, according to the prophet's declaration, hath showed himself to us, that the tabernacle fixing of this our tenement that has been dissolved may be kept for humankind. A material decoration, that is, may be begun again by means of the concourse of our scattered atoms. For that word, pukasmos, in its peculiar meaning, signifies the temple circuit and the decoration which completes it. Now, this passage from the Psalms runs as follows. God and Lord hath showed himself to us. Keep the feast amongst the decorators, even unto the horns of the altar. And this seems to me to proclaim in metaphors the fact that one single feast is to be kept by the whole rational creation, and that in that assembly of the saints, the inferiors are to join the dance with their superiors. For in the case of the fabric of that temple, which was the type, it was not allowed to all who were on the outside of its circuit to come within, but everything that was Gentile and alien was prohibited from entering. And of those further who had entered, all were not equally privileged to advance toward the center, but only those who had consecrated themselves by a holy manner of life and by certain sprinklings. And again, not everyone amongst these might set foot within the interior of the temple. The priests alone had the right of entering within the curtain, and that only for the service of the sanctuary, while even to the priests the darkened shrine of the temple, where stood the beautiful altar with its jutting horns, was forbidden, except to one of them who held the highest office of the priesthood, and who once a year on a stated day and unattended passed within it, carrying an offering more than usually sacred and mystical. Such being the differences in connection with this temple which you know of, it was clearly a representation and an imitation of the condition of the spirit world. The lesson taught by these material observances being this, that it is not the whole of the rational creation that can approach the temple of God, or, in other words, the adoration of the Almighty, but that those who are led astray by false persuasions are outside the precinct of the deity, and that from the number of those who by virtue of this adoration have been preferred to the rest and admitted within it, some, by reason of sprinklings and purifications, have still further privileges, and again, Amongst these last, those who have been consecrated priests have privileges further still, even to being admitted to the mysteries of the interior. And that one may bring into still clearer light the meaning of the allegory, we may understand the word here as teaching this, that amongst all the powers endued with reason, some have been fixed like a holy altar in the inmost shrine of the deity, and that again of these last, some jut forward like horns for their eminence, and that around them others are arranged first or second, according to a prescribed sequence of rank. That the race of man, on the contrary, on account of indwelling evil, was excluded from the divine precinct, but that purified with lustral water, it re-enters it. And since all the further barriers by which our sin has fenced us off from the things within the veil are, in the end, to be taken down, whenever the time comes that the tabernacle of our nature is, as it were, to be fixed up again in the resurrection, and all the inveterate corruption of sin has vanished from the world, then a universal feast will be kept around the deity by those who have decorated themselves in the resurrection. And one and the same banquet will be spread for all, with no differences cutting off any rational creature from an equal participation in it. For those who are now excluded by reason of their sin will at last be admitted within the holiest places of God's blessedness, and will bind themselves to the horns of the altar there, that is, to the most excellent of the transcendental powers. The Apostle says the same thing more plainly when he indicates the final accord of the whole universe with the good, that to him every knee shall bow, of things in heaven and things in earth and things under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Instead of the horns, speaking of that which is angelic and in heaven, and by the other terms signifying ourselves, the creatures whom we think of next to that. One festival of united voices shall occupy us all. That festival shall be the confession and the recognition of the being who truly is. One might, she proceeded, select many other passages of Holy Scripture to establish the doctrine of the resurrection. For instance, Ezekiel leaps in the spirit of prophecy over all the intervening time with its vast duration. He stands by his powers of foresight in the actual moment of the resurrection, and as if he had really gazed on what is still to come, brings it in his description before our eyes. He saw a mighty plain unfolded to an endless distance before him, and vast heaps of bones upon it, flung at random, some this way, some that. And then, upon their impulse from God, these bones began to move and group themselves with their fellows that they once owned, and adhere to the familiar sockets, and then clothe themselves with muscle, flesh, and skin, which was the process called decorating in the poetry of the Psalms. A spirit, in fact, was giving life and movement to everything that lay there. But as regards our apostles' description of the wonders of the resurrection, why should one repeat it, seeing that it can be easily found and read? How, for instance, with a shout and the sound of trumpets, in the language of the word, all dead and prostrate things shall be changed in the twinkling of an eye into immortal beings. The expressions in the gospel also I will pass over, for their meaning is quite clear to everyone. And our Lord does not declare in word alone that the bodies of the dead shall be raised up again, but he shows in action the resurrection itself, making a beginning of this work of wonder from things more within our reach and less capable of being doubted. First, that is, he displays his life-giving power in the case of the deadly forms of disease, and chases those maladies by one word of command. Then he raises a little girl just dead. Then he makes a young man who is already being carried out sit up on his bier and delivers him to his mother. After that, he calls forth from his tomb the 4 days dead and already decomposed Lazarus, vivifying the prostrate body with his commanding voice. Then, after 3 days, he raises from the dead his own human body, pierced though it was with the nails and the spear, and brings the print of those nails and the spear wound to witness to the resurrection. But I think that a detailed mention of these things is not necessary, for no doubt about them lingers in the minds of those who have accepted the written accounts of them. But that, said I, was not the point in question. Most of your hearers will assent to the fact that there will someday be a resurrection, and that man will be brought before the incorruptible tribunal, on account both of the scripture proofs and also of our previous examination of the question. But still, the question remains, is the state which we are to expect to be like the present state of the body? Because if so, then, as I was saying, men had better avoid hoping for any resurrection at all. For if our bodies are to be restored to life again in the same sort of condition as they are in when they cease to breathe, then all that man can look forward to in the resurrection is an unending calamity. For what spectacle is more piteous than when in extreme old age our bodies shrivel up and change into something repulsive and hideous, with the flesh all wasted in the length of years, the skin dried up about the bones until it is all in wrinkles, the muscles in a spasmodic state from being no longer enriched with their natural moisture, and the whole body consequently shrunk, the hands on either side powerless to perform their natural work, shaken with an involuntary trembling. What a sight, again, are the bodies of persons in a long consumption! They differ from bare bones only in giving the appearance of being covered with a worn-out veil of skin. What a sight, too, are those of persons swollen with the disease of dropsy. What words could describe the unsightly disfigurement of sufferers from leprosy? Gradually, over all their limbs and organs of sensation, rottenness spreads and devours them. What words could describe that of persons who have been mutilated in earthquake, battle, or any other visitation, and live on in such a plight for a long time before their natural deaths? Or of those who from an injury have grown up from infancy with their limbs awry? What can one say of them? What is one to think about the bodies of newborn infants who have been either exposed or strangled or died a natural death, if they are to be brought to life again just as they were? Are they to continue in that infantile state? What condition could be more miserable than that? Or are they to come to the flower of their age? Well, but what sort of milk has nature got to suckle them with? It comes then to this, that if our bodies are to live again in every respect the same as before, this thing that we are expecting is simply a calamity. Whereas if they are not the same, the person raised up will be another than he who died. If, for instance, a little boy was buried, but a grown man rises again, or, reversely, how how can we say that the dead in his very self is raised up, when he has had someone substituted for him by virtue of this difference in age? Instead of the child, one sees a grown-up man. Instead of the old man, one sees a person in his prime. In fact, instead of the one person, another entirely. The cripple is changed into the able-bodied man, the consumptive sufferer into a man whose flesh is firm, and so on, of all possible cases, not to enumerate them for fear of being prolix. If then the body will not come to life again, just such in its attributes as it was when it mingled with the earth, that dead body will not rise again. But on the contrary, the earth will be formed into another man. How then will the resurrection affect myself when instead of me someone else will come to life? Someone else, I say. For how could I recognize myself when, instead of what was once myself, I see someone not myself? It cannot really be I, unless it is in every respect the same as myself. Suppose, for instance, in this life I had in my memory the traits of someone. Say he was bald, had prominent lips, a somewhat flat nose, a fair complexion, gray eyes, white hair, wrinkled skin. And then went to look for such a one, and met a young man with a fine head of hair, an aquiline nose, a dark complexion, and in all other respects quite different in his type of countenance. Am I likely, in seeing the latter, to think of the former? But why dwell longer on these, the less forcible objections to the resurrection, and neglect the strongest one of all? For who has not heard that human life is like a stream, moving from birth to death at a certain rate of progress, and only ceasing from that progressive movement when it ceases also to exist? This movement, indeed, is not one of spatial change. Our bulk never exceeds itself. But it makes this advance by means of internal alteration. And as long as this alteration is that which its name implies, it never remains at the same stage from moment to moment. For how can that which is being altered be kept in any sameness? The fire on the candle wick, as far as appearance goes, certainly seems always the same, the continuity of its movement giving it the look of being an uninterrupted and self-centered whole. But in reality it is always passing itself along and never remains the same. The moisture which is extracted by the heat is burnt up and changed into smoke the moment it is burst into flame. And this alterative force affects the movement of the flame, working by itself the change of the subject matter into smoke. Just then as it is impossible for one who has touched that flame twice on the same place to touch twice the very same flame, for the speed of the alteration is too quick, it does not wait for that second touch, however rapidly it may be effected. The flame is always fresh and new. It is always being produced, always transmitting itself, never remaining at one and the same place. A thing of the same kind is found to be the case with the constitution of our body. There is influx and efflux going on in it, in an alterative progress, until the moment that it ceases to live. As long as it is living, it has no stay, for it is either being replenished, or it is discharging in vapor, or it is being kept in motion by both of these processes combined. If then a particular man is not even the same as he was yesterday, but is made different by this transmutation, when so be that the resurrection shall restore our body to life again, that single man will become a crowd of human beings, so that with his rising again there will be found the babe, the child, the boy, the youth, the man, the father, the old man, and all the intermediate persons that he once was. But further, chastity and profligacy are both carried on in the flesh. Those also who endure the most painful tortures for their religion, and those, on the other hand, who shrink from such, both one class and the other reveal their character in relation to fleshly sensations. How, then, can justice be done at the judgment? Or take the case of one and the same man first sinning and then cleansing himself by repentance, and then, it might so happen, relapsing into his sin. In such a case, both the defiled and undefiled body alike undergoes a change as his nature changes, and neither of them continue to the end the same. Which body, then, is the profligate to be tortured in? In that which is stiffened with old age and near to death? This is not the same as that which did the sin. In that, then, which defiled itself by giving way to passion? But where is the old man in that case? The last, in fact, will not rise again, and the resurrection will not do a complete work. Or else, he will rise while the criminal will escape. Let me say something else also from amongst the objections made by unbelievers to this doctrine. No part, they urge, of the body is made by nature without a function. Some parts, for instance, are the efficient causes within us of our being alive. Without them, our life in the flesh could not possibly be carried on. Such are the heart, liver, brain, lungs, stomach, and the other vitals. Others are assigned to the activities of sensation, others to those of handling and walking. Others are adapted for the transmission of a posterity. Now, if the life to come is to be in exactly the same circumstances as this, the supposed change in us is reduced to nothing. But if the report is true, as indeed it is, which represents marriage as forming no part of the economy of that afterlife, and eating and drinking as not then preserving its continuance, what use will there be for the members of the body, when we are no longer to expect in that existence any of the activities for which our members now exist? If for the sake of marriage there are now certain organs adapted for marriage, then whenever the latter ceases to be, we shall not need those organs. The same may be said of the hands for working with, the feet for running with, the mouth for taking food with, the teeth for grinding it with, the organs of the stomach for digesting, the evacuating ducts for getting rid of that which has become superfluous. When, therefore, all those operations will be no more, how and wherefore will their instruments exist? So that necessarily, if the things that are not going to contribute in any way to that other life are not to surround the body, none of the parts which at present constitute the body would exist either. That life, then, will be carried on by other instruments, and no one could call such a state of things a resurrection, where the particular members are no longer present in the body, owing to their being useless to that life. But if, on the other hand, our resurrection will be represented in every one of these, then the author of the resurrection will fashion things in us of no use and advantage to that life. And yet we must believe not only that there is a resurrection, but also that it will not be an absurdity. We must therefore listen attentively to the explanation of this, so that for every part of the truth we may have its probability saved to the last. When I had finished, the teacher thus replied, "You have attacked the doctrines connected with the resurrection with some spirit, in the way of rhetoric, as it is called. You have coursed round and round the truth with plausibly subversive arguments, so much so that those who have not very carefully considered this mysterious truth might possibly be affected in their view of it by the likelihood of those arguments, and might think that the difficulty started against what has been advanced was not altogether beside the point. But," she proceeded, "the truth does not lie in these arguments, even though we may find it impossible to give a rhetorical answer to them, couched in equally strong language. The true explanation of all these questions is still stored up in the hidden treasure rooms of wisdom, and will not come to the light until that moment when we shall be taught the mystery of the resurrection by the reality of it. And then there will be no more need of phrases to explain the things which we now hope for. Just as many questions might be started for debate amongst people sitting up at night as to the thing that sunshine is, and then the simple appearing of it in all its beauty would render any verbal description superfluous. So every calculation that tries to arrive conjecturally at the future state will be reduced to nothingness by the object of our hopes when it comes upon us. But since it is our duty not to leave the arguments brought against us in any way unexamined, we will expound the truth as to these points as follows. First, let us get a clear notion as to the scope of this doctrine. In other words, what is the end that Holy Scripture has in view in promulgating it and creating the belief in it? Well, to sketch the outline of so vast a truth and to embrace it in a definition, we will say that the resurrection is the reconstitution of our nature in its original form. In that form of life, of which God Himself was the creator, it is reasonable to believe that there was neither age nor infancy, nor any of the sufferings arising from our present various infirmities, nor any kind of bodily affliction whatever. It is reasonable, I say, to believe that God was the creator of none of these things, but that man was a thing divine before his humanity got within reach of the assault of evil. That then, however, with the inroad of evil, all these afflictions also broke in upon him. Accordingly, a life that is free from evil is under no necessity whatever of being passed amidst the things which result from evil. It follows that when a man travels through ice, he must get his body chilled, or when he walks in a very hot sun, that he must get his skin darkened. But if he has kept clear of the one or the other, he escapes these results entirely, both the darkening and the chilling. No one, in fact, when a particular cause was removed, would be justified in looking for the effect of that particular cause. Just so, our nature, becoming passional, had to encounter all the necessary results of a life of passion. But when it shall have started back to that state of passionless blessedness, it will no longer encounter the inevitable results of evil tendencies. Seeing then that all the infusions of the life of the brute into our nature were not in us before our humanity descended, through the touch of evil, into passions, most certainly when we abandon those passions, we shall abandon all their visible results. No one, therefore, will be justified in seeking in that other life for the consequences in us of any passion. Just as if a man clad in a ragged tunic who has divested himself of the garb feels no more its disgrace upon him, so we too, when we have cast off that dead, unsightly tunic made from the skins of brutes and put upon us, for I take the coat of skins of animals to mean that conformation belonging to a brute nature with which we were clothed when we became familiar with passionate indulgence, shall, along with the casting off of that tunic, fling from us all the belongings that were round us of that skin of a brute. And such accretions as sexual intercourse, conception, parturition, impurities, suckling, feeding, evacuation, gradual growth to full size, prime of life, old age, disease, and death. If that skin is no longer around us, how can its resulting consequences be left behind within us? It is folly, then, when we are to expect a different state of things in the life to come, to object to the doctrine of the resurrection on the ground of something that has nothing to do with it. I mean, what has thinness or corpulence, a state of consumption or of plethora, or any other condition supervening in a nature that is ever in a flux, to do with the other life, stranger as it is to any fleeting and transitory passing such as that? One thing and one thing only is required for the operation of the resurrection, viz., that a man should have lived by being born, or to use rather the gospel words, that a man should be born into the world. The length or briefness of the life, the manner this or that of the death, is an irrelevant subject of inquiry in connection with that operation. Whatever instance we take, howsoever we suppose this to have been, it is all the same. From these differences in life, there arises no difficulty any more than any facility with regard to the resurrection. He who has once begun to live must necessarily go on, having once lived, after his intervening dissolution in death has been repaired in the resurrection. As to the how and when of his dissolution, what do they matter to the resurrection? Consideration of such points belongs to another line of inquiry altogether. For instance, a man may have lived in bodily comfort or in affliction, virtuously or viciously, renowned or disgraced. He may have passed his days miserably or happily. These and such like results must be obtained from the length of his life and the manner of his living. And to be able to pass a judgment on the things done in his life, it will be necessary for the judge to scrutinize his indulgences, as the case may be, or his losses, or his disease, or his old age, or his prime, or his youth, or his wealth, or his poverty. How well or ill a man, placed in either of these, concluded his destined career. Whether he was the recipient of many blessings or of many ills in a length of life, or tasted neither of them at all, but ceased to live before his mental powers were formed. But whenever the time come that God shall have brought our nature back to the primal state of man, it will be useless to talk of such things then, and to imagine that objections based upon such things can prove God's power to be impeded in arriving at his end. His end is one and one only. It is this: when the complete whole of our race shall have been perfected from the first man to the last, some having at once in this life being cleansed from evil, others having afterward, in the necessary periods, been healed by the fire, others having in their life here been unconscious equally of good and of evil, to offer to every one of us participation in the blessings which are in Him, which, the Scripture tells us, eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor thought ever reached. But this is nothing else, as I at least understand it, but to be in God Himself. For the good which is above hearing and eye and heart must be that good which transcends the universe. But the difference between the virtuous life and the life full of vice, led at the present time, will be illustrated in this way, viz., in the quicker or tardier participation of each in that promised blessedness. According to the amount of the ingrained wickedness of each will be computed the duration of his cure. The cure consists in the cleansing of his soul, and that cannot be achieved without an excruciating condition, as has been expounded in our previous discussion. But anyone would more fully comprehend the futility and irrelevancy of all these objections by trying to fathom the depths of our apostles' wisdom when explaining this mystery to the Corinthians, who perhaps themselves were bringing forward the same objections to it as its impugners today bring forward to overthrow our faith. He proceeds on his own authority to chide the audacity of their ignorance, and speaks thus: "You will say then to me, how are the dead raised up, and with what body do they come? You fool, that which you sow is not quickened except it die, and that which you sow not that body that shall be, but bare grain. It may chance of wheat or of some other grain. But God gives it a body as it has pleased Him." In that passage, as it seems to me, he gags the mouths of men who display their ignorance of the fitting proportions in nature, and who measure the divine power by their own strength, and think that only so much is possible to God as the human understanding can take in, but that what is beyond it surpasses also the divine ability. For the man who had asked the apostle, "How are the dead raised up?" evidently implies that it is impossible, when once the body's atoms have been scattered, that they should again come in concourse together. And this being impossible, and no other possible form of body, besides that arising from such a concourse, being left, he, after the fashion of clever controversialists, concludes the truth of what he wants to prove by a species of syllogism. Thus: "If a body is a concourse of atoms, and a second assemblage of these is impossible, what sort of body will those get who rise again?" This conclusion, involved seemingly in this artful contrivance of premises, the apostle calls folly, as coming from men who failed to perceive in other parts of the creation the masterliness of the divine power. For omitting the sublimer miracles of God's hand, by which it would have been easy to place his hearer in a dilemma. For instance, he might have asked, how or whence comes a heavenly body, that of the sun, for example, or the moon, or that which is seen in the constellations? Whence comes the firmament, the air, water, the earth? He, on the contrary, convicts the objectors of inconsiderateness by means of objects which grow alongside us and are very familiar to all. Does not even husbandry teach you, he asks, that the man who in calculating the transcendent powers of the deity limits them by his own is a fool? Whence do seeds get the bodies that spring up from them? What precedes this springing up? Is it not a death which precedes? At least, if the dissolution of a compacted whole is a death. For indeed it cannot be supposed that the seed would spring up into a shoot unless it had been dissolved in the soil, and so become spongy and porous to such an extent as to mingle its own qualities with the adjacent moisture of the soil, and thus become transformed into a root and a shoot. Not stopping even there, but changing again into the stalk, with its intervening knee joints that gird it up like so many clasps, to enable it to carry with figure erect the ear with its load of grain. Where then were all these things belonging to grain before its dissolution in the soil? And yet this result sprang from that grain. If that grain had not existed first, the ear of grain would not have arisen. Just then, as the body of the ear comes to light out of the seed, God's artistic touch of power, producing it all out of that single thing. And just as it is neither entirely the same thing as that seed, nor something altogether different, so, she insisted, by these miracles performed on seeds, you may now interpret the mystery of the resurrection. The divine power, in the superabundance of omnipotence, does not only restore you that body once dissolved, but makes great and splendid additions to it, whereby the human being is furnished in a manner more magnificent. It is sown, he says, in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. The grain of wheat, after its dissolution in the soil, leaves behind the slightness of its bulk and the peculiar quality of its shape. And yet it has not left and lost itself, but still, self-centered, grows into the ear. Though in many points it has made an advance upon itself, viz., in size, in splendor, in complexity, in form. In the same fashion, the human being deposits in death all those peculiar surroundings which it has acquired from passionate propensities. Dishonor, I mean, and corruption and weakness and characteristics of age. And yet, the human being does not lose itself. It changes into an ear of grain, as it were, into incorruption, that is, and glory and honor and power and absolute perfection, into a condition in which its life is no longer carried on in the ways peculiar to mere nature, but has passed into a spiritual and passionless existence. For it is the peculiarity of the natural body to be always moving on a stream, to be always altering from its state for the moment, and changing into something else. But none of these processes which we observe not in man only, but also in plants and animals, will be found remaining in the life that shall be then. Further, it seems to me that the words of the apostle, in every respect, harmonize with our own conception of the resurrection. They indicate the very same thing that we have embodied in our own definition of it, wherein we said that the resurrection is no other thing than the reconstitution of our nature in its original form. For whereas we learn from Scripture in the account of the first creation that first the earth brought forth the green herb, as the narrative says, and that then from this plant seed was yielded, from which when it was shed on the ground, the same form of the original plant again sprang up. The apostle, it is to be observed, declares that this very same thing happens in the resurrection also. And so we learn from him the fact, not only that our humanity will then be changed into something nobler, but also that what we have therein to expect is nothing else than that which was at the beginning. In the beginning, we see, it was not an ear rising from a grain, but a grain coming from an ear. And after that, the ear grows round the grain. And so the order indicated in this similitude clearly shows that all that blessed state which arises for us by means of the resurrection is only a return to our pristine state of grace. We too were once, in a fashion, a full ear, in fact, but the burning heat of sin withered us up, and then, on our dissolution by death, the earth received us. But in the spring of the resurrection, she will reproduce this naked grain of our body in the form of an ear of grain, tall, well-proportioned and erect, reaching to the heights of heaven, and, for blade and beard, resplendent in incorruption, and with all the other godlike marks. For this corruptible must put on incorruptible. And this incorruption and glory and honor and power are those distinct and acknowledged marks of deity which once belonged to him who was created in God's image, and which we hope for hereafter. The first man, Adam, that is, was the first ear of grain, but with the arrival of evil human nature was diminished into a mere multitude. And as happens to the grain on the ear, each individual man was denuded of the beauty of that primal ear, and moldered in the soil. But in the resurrection, we are born again in our original splendor, only instead of that single primitive ear, we become the countless myriads of ears in the wheat fields. The virtuous life, as contrasted with that of vice, is distinguished thus. Those who while living have by virtuous conduct exercised husbandry, agriculture on themselves, are at once revealed in all the qualities of a perfect ear of grain, while those whose bare grain, that is, the forces of their natural soul, has become through evil habits, degenerate, as it were, and hardened by the weather, as the seeds they call hornstruck, according to the experts in such things, grow up, will, though they live again in the resurrection, experience very great severity from the judge, because they do not possess the strength to shoot up into the full proportions of an ear of grain, and thereby become that which we were before our earthly fall. The remedy offered by the overseer of the produce is to collect together the tares and the thorns which have grown up with the good seed, and into whose bastard life all the secret forces that once nourished its root have passed, so that it not only has had to remain without its nutriment, but has been choked and so rendered unproductive by this unnatural growth. When from the nutritive part within them, everything that is the reverse or the counterfeit of it has been picked out and has been committed to the fire that consumes everything unnatural, and so has disappeared, then in this class also their humanity will thrive and will ripen into fruit-bearing, owing to such husbandry. And someday, after long courses of ages, will get back again that universal form which God stamped upon us at the beginning. Blessed are they, indeed, in whom the full beauty of those years shall be developed directly they are born in the resurrection. Yet we say this without implying that any merely bodily distinctions will be manifest between those who have lived virtuously and those who have lived full of vice in this life, as if we ought to think that one will be imperfect as regards his material frame, while another will win perfection regarding it. The prisoner and the free, here in this present world, are just alike as regards the constitutions of their two bodies, though as regards enjoyment and suffering, the gulf is wide between them. In this way, I take it, should we reckon the difference between the good and bad in that intervening time. For the perfection of bodies that rise from that sowing of death is, as the Apostle tells us, to consist in incorruption and glory and honor and power. But any diminution in such excellences does not denote a corresponding bodily mutilation of him who has risen again, but a withdrawal and an estrangement from each one of those things which are conceived of as belonging to the good. Seeing then that one or the other of these two diametrically opposed ideas, I mean good and evil, must anyway attach to us, it is clear that to say a man is not included in the good is a necessary demonstration that he is included in the evil. But then, in connection with evil, we find no honor, no glory, no incorruption, no power. And so we are forced to dismiss all doubt that a man who has nothing to do with these last mentioned things must be connected with their opposites, viz., with weakness, with dishonor, with corruption, with everything of that nature, such as we spoke of in the previous parts of the discussion, when we said how many were the passions sprung from evil, which are so hard for the soul to get rid of, when they have infused themselves into the very substance of the soul's entire nature and become one with it. When such, then, have been purged from it and utterly removed by the healing processes worked out by the fire, then every one of the things which make up our conception of the good will come to take their place. Incorruption, that is, and life, and honor, and grace, and glory, and everything else that we conjecture is to be seen in God and in His image. Man, as he was made,